there's no way that this small group of roundtable speakers could really represent, Barry's rich intellectual and professional legacy. I think he deserves to have a separate conference, 2 or 3 days conference to really honor and celebrate Professor Barry Gills' work. But I'm not a speaker of this part, so I'm very happy that that Professor Franklin Obeng Odom has decided to chair and also act as moderator of Barry Gill's keynote lecture, and then afterwards Barry's roundtable. Well, we gonna honor Barry. So to introduce Professor Barry Gills, I'm calling on Professor Franklin Obeng Odom. Yeah.
Okay. So, many thanks, Bon. Our distinguished speaker today is something too short. Our distinguished speaker, our first keynote address, keynote speaker today, is something of a maverick in development studies, a field which is currently like a broken mirror. He's against both the highly influential development economics, often seen as the orthodoxy, and against the fairy post-development alternative that paints everything before it as the problem. The orthodoxy recurrently sees the lack of growth as the problem. The alternative sees both the attainment of growth and development as egregiously wrong. The professors in the orthodoxy show academic snobbery. Those in the heterodoxy contemplate class suicide. Theatrics, which our soft-spoken distinguished lecturer strongly opposes. But it is not even clear whether this so-called heterodoxy or heterodox challenge is all for show, much like how the poor in Indonesia recite poetry about horrendous conditions in which they live for empathy and charity. Our surveys upon surveys show that public trust in economists is only higher than trust in crooked politicians. Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, winners of the Nobel Prize for their work in development economics, propose an answer that they say is mega. Make economics great again. Our speaker is still unfazed, mainly because his primary concern is the lack of holistic historical methodology. The mainstream failed experimental approaches and emphasis on how free and big money can do the job of development quickly amplify the contradictions in the field. And I intend no pun. But is the post-development alternative and its contention to euthanize development any historically sound? Juhani Kopponen, an historian of development, points out that not only is the post-development characterization ahistorical, its history of the field is both, quote, invented and shallow, unquote. In his lifetime, Herman Daly, the eminent ecological economist, agreed, but offered another ahistorical claim. Quote, the problem is growth. not development, unquote. And yet, degrowth and post-development have become omnipresent, phonetically and fanatically. The themes in one recent conference graphically illustrate this fanfare. Feminist political ecology and degrowth, decoloniality and degrowth, anarchism and degrowth, rural and urban dialogues on degrowth, Green New Deals and degrowth, cultural politics of degrowth, embodying degrowth, social movements and degrowth. All pressing and present challenges, no doubt, but our keynote speaker would probably question how sustainable is a species that forgets its past. The critique that capitalism is the problem is, of course, historical. But the world did not begin with capitalism or neoliberalism. These are quite recent compared to, say, imperialism, whose theories are rather distinct. In the words of Fernand Braudel, an historical approach must be, and I quote, the sum of all possible histories, those of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, unquote. This holistic approach to development is precisely what is needed, but it is exactly what is usually neglected, except, of course, in the works of Barry Gills, our distinguished speaker, who once observed, and I quote, ideally, we should study world development as something that has been going on for centuries, if not millennia. It is a central matter from a methodological perspective. Everything depends on it, unquote. Barry Gills is currently the most senior professor of global development studies, not only at the University of Helsinki, but also in Finland, literally and figuratively. Before coming to Helsinki, Gills worked as professor of global politics at Newcastle University and as the director of the Globalization Research Center at the University of Hawaii. He has worked in three pivotal areas: world system theory, globalizations, and the historical approach to ecological development, areas in which he has authored, co-authored, or edited more than 20 books. Simultaneously, he has spread his rebellion by helping to publish more than 100 books in his book series. Most social scientists are ignored, not Professor Gills. His work has been vigorously engaged, making him one of the most cited scholars in both development studies and the social sciences more widely, nationally and globally. Academia aside, the media has been obsessed with what Professor Gills has to say. Journalists' requests for interviews, media mentions, and media rankings cement Professor Gills' standing as one of the most serious public intellectuals of our time. As fundamentally still is Professor Gills' leadership of and service to the field, not only as a scholar, but also as an institutional builder, teacher, and mentor. He's a co-founder of the World Historical Systems Theory Group of the International Studies Association, the sole founding editor and editor-in-chief of the academic journal Globalizations, the sole founding and co-book series editor of Rethinking Globalizations, and co-founding member of EXALT, the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative. Recognized with the International Studies Association's James N. Rosenow Award, election to the World Academy of Art and Science, and Best International Teacher, Professor Gills is clearly primus inter pares. But Like all rebels, Gills has also been the subject of much criticism, some of which are frankly hocus pocus. A reminder of what Daniel Raymond noted in his 1820 treatise, Thoughts on Political Economy. Quote, although his theory is founded upon the principles of nature, and although it is impossible to discover any flaws in his reasoning, yet the mind instinctively revolts at the conclusions to which he conducts it, and we are disposed to reject the theory even though we could give no good grounds, unquote. This sort of criticism must be dismissed, not only because it offers nothing to discuss, but also because, as J.M. Keynes noted in the preface of his General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, quote, the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones, unquote. But other criticisms need answers. Has Professor Gills dragged development studies too much into ecological concerns, sidelining traditional development issues? Under his watch, has development studies become too eclectic, such that development research is everything, with whatever methodologies, and therefore the study of nothing? And are there apparent inconsistencies between a one world system where no economic system must be privileged and Gills' persistent emphasis on capitalism in his work? Professor Gills has successfully debated André Gunder-Frank, a scholar whose interpersonal relations Immanuel Wallerstein euphemistically described as, quote, notoriously difficult. Debated whether the world system must be spelt with or without a hyphen, and debated whether the world system is 500 or 5,000 years old. But can he address these three big questions? Or is it even fair to pose these questions to one person? Walter Rodney, the great Guyanese political economist, once noted that, quote, responsibility in matters of these sorts is always collective, unquote. So, to address these questions is an excellent panel constituted by Walden Bello, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of the Philippines, Kevin Gray, Professor of International Relations at Sussex University, S.A. Hamed Husseini, Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the University of Newcastle, Don Marshall, Professor of Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Jamie Morgan, Professor of Economics, Leeds Beckett University, our own Anya Newgren, Professor of Global Development Studies, University of Helsinki, and our own Antti Taivanen, doctoral scholar in Global Development Studies here at the University of Helsinki. But first, please join me in welcoming Professor Gills to set out his life in development studies.
Well, as ever, you're too generous and also rightly astute and critical to sort of, you didn't come to praise, but also, to challenge. That's good. I should, and it is important protocol to give heartfelt thanks to everyone who organized this for me and invited me, all the panelists, in particular, the co-organizers here, Bon, Franklin, everyone, Tina, and all my colleagues and friends, and my family, because this isn't about me. This is about us. And I wouldn't have been able to do anything without the help of my colleagues. So, okay. The title of this, we sort of put out the message that this is reflections And that's what it is. And I have been reflecting and remembering and recommitting for many weeks now. It has been in my mind to compose this. So about the title, a life or life in development, a life in development, which are the same. They cannot be separated. And so all life is in development in a lowercase d, this is clear. And each of our own lives is lived in a context of an organizing principle or concept we call development with an uppercase. And it is inescapable. We are born into these conditions historically, both collectively and individually. So there's life in development and a life in development for us all, individually and collectively. And each life, a life, is a unique experience despite the structural conditions. And so the themes I'm going to address in broad ways, as much as I am able today, are the relationships and method in this field, or my reflections on understanding through time, history, and process, and how they relate methodologically. So I'm going to start, perhaps unusually, with invoking Tolstoy and Braudel. Franklin said there was an oddity in my work that I've never cited Braudel. And I said, oh, that's true. Although I read, the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II, Civilization and Capitalism. I read and admired Braudel, and of course the lineages of Braudel and the Braudel Center and so on. But I never cited him, that's true. But then I had already decided to use Braudel today before you pointed that out to me. So it's right here. So Tolstoy and Braudel, why them on the framing of life and time and history and process? So Tolstoy, my dear friend Boris Kagarlitsky in Russia, who is now in prison, a military tribunal decided on Tuesday to send him to prison for 5 years. We all believe it's politically motivated and for his opposition to the war in Ukraine. But he told me many years ago that during the Soviet era, he's been imprisoned by every regime since Brezhnev, by the way, in Russia. And makes quite good jokes about it. But he said that the people honored Tolstoy as their inner life in the Soviet time. What did he mean? Well, for example, in War and Peace, there are 3 life-scapes that we all experience. And the first is the great external events of the world on a huge canvas, monumental, tumultuous, immense, unavoidable, but external. You, I, we don't have control over them. Well, or almost none. We must experience them, and every lifetime they happen. And then there is the sort of sphere of the personal life world, our own relationships, all the encounters we make, all the mentors we have, all the loves and friends and colleagues and the work we do, purpose we have. In that sphere, we have some choice. We are constrained by conditions, but we have choices and they have consequences. We build that. And the final one is the inner life, which is where we only ourselves alone live that. As we are born and as we die, it is only us. But in that inner life, there's the most profound source of meaning and of strength, of purpose, of understanding. We have to cultivate it, otherwise it might languish. But it is all important, and we live in all 3 simultaneously in every life. And so that's also life in development. But it depends on how we engage, each of us, how we choose to engage with these lifescapes. That is for us to decide. And on Braudel, to combine Tolstoy with Braudel, I mean, his framings of historical time are well known, and many of my colleagues in the past educated me in terms of how they would deploy them in international political economy. I think the essential contrast he is making is between what might be called deep historical time and structures and processes, and transient, momentary appearances and moments, events, both of which exist, but we need to differentiate them and understand their relation to each other and our response and engagement with them. So Braudel frames history in these timescapes and the very well-known longue durée, of which, of course, I'm most attracted. And maybe my long is longer than some others. But that's a scape in which great structures of history, if you want to call them that, or historical social systems, have their history over many centuries or even in millennia. And that include, for example, looking at civilizations or historical social systems or capitalism in its origins, apogee, and demise. And then there's a kind of intermediate time in which you can see the playing out of particular junctures, and where you can in a lifetime you can see the playing out of a particular pattern, a process, a phase, a cycle, in historical time as you experience it. And then there are the events, which are ongoing, lived experience, moments, flashes, constant, perpetual, immediate lived experience. And so, again, there are the three scapes are all in one, as with Tolstoy. And then I'm putting Tolstoy and Braudel together to say, I think this helps me understand, as I've been reflecting, life in development and a life in development, played out through these six scapes together, both individually and collectively, socially, historically, for myself and for us all. Because we are each born into a very particular time, and we are born into very particular historical conditions. Each and every one of us in our time, and these have historical potentialities, their own contradictions, their own possibilities, and there are also critical junctures or inflection points historically in our lifetime, where the balance of forces within a given socio-historical structure shows a precipitant moment of potentiality. The potentiality is to alter the historical direction and the substance of the existing social order. These are what I call critical junctures, and they are of the greatest importance, both analytically, theoretically, and practically, to which we are compelled to respond. So my late friend and my dear friend and mentor, Gunnar Frank, who was writing in the early 1960s, laid out the task for development studies as he saw it in his time, but for the future. I think you might see its relevance. He says, this reality of capitalism, of its contradictions, development and underdevelopment, impose on us important tasks of scientific theory and research, and of political strategy and tactics. We must formulate scientific theory capable of encompassing and explaining the nature, contradictions, historical development, and underdevelopment of this whole worldwide process and system as a whole. And we must pursue research which is designed and adequate for formulating such theory. Well put, good. And so I think I feel compelled to say that we are morally called upon in our life and development, historically, to stand with the oppressed wherever we find them, And if not, then to be complicit in their oppression and their suffering. To stand with them, to be with them, to walk with them, and to learn from them, and also to be led by them is most important. And it makes us more humble and perhaps closer to reality, outside of our privileged conditions that many of us are born into. So how did I come to this field myself? I entered university as a young fellow in 1974, and I began to study the non-Western world, its arts, philosophy, history, the lot. I was immediately fascinated by non-Eurocentric knowledge. I wanted to seek enlightenment there and understanding. So, but when I did that, when I started to do that, and the more I did it for a few years there in the 70s, I came to a kind of, I don't know, awakening, a realization, but through experience, you come to this conscientization if you make the effort, because it's there. And that was that the world had been shaped by centuries. The world I was living in and what was happening in the world at that time when I was awakening was the product of centuries of brutal violence, conquest. It's unimaginable in its horror. And it's, we call it colonialism, imperialism, capitalist modernity. There are many words it goes by, but it's unfathomable to us in its violence. And the degree to which it embedded into global history and global society that we are born into is inestimably great. So I realized this, and I went, well, this is so vital, so central to everything. I'm going to go there. I'm going to study and study and study and study. So I did. And at the same time, it was already apparent to me, and not only me, but many people at that very time, that, the trajectory that our civilization is on is potentially catastrophic. Why? Because humanity has decided to treat all other life in the life domain of the planet through objectification. It's not sacred, it's not living. These are things to be manipulated and destroyed for our desires. And it had gotten already so out of control, and the trajectories were so clear. And like many in my generation, I read The Limits to Growth, and I read the reports of the Club of Rome, and I read various other things around that, Ivan Illich and various things you read in those days. And you wait, all right, it's coming. And so I need to engage with that. I will be aware of that, although I have to say that for a very long time I wasn't very aware of it in my work, because I became so fixated on what I had learned in international political economy. And as a political economist, you there's a temptation to just stray over to become more and more an economist. No offense to economists. Although my mentor, Susan Strange, the late professor of international political economy at the LSE, she used to say to us students, always attack the economists. and anyway, that's what we do. And there's plenty to criticize, that they don't sufficiently understand the political in the economic. And the social theory that seems to be lacking, and the historiography there's plenty for us to criticize. So enjoy it, embrace it. So I did. This has to do with intentions and purpose and our own meaning making, because in academia we are actually engaged in the construction of knowledge, but also meaning making. For ourselves, for our students, for society, for history. and it's recorded. And it matters because, as Hadley Bull used to say, thinking is research too. Thought is action. It is not non-action. So we should never underestimate what we do or the importance of knowledge construction and the debate over the most essential and important future-determining ideas of our time. That's extraordinarily important, and we have to take it with all the seriousness it deserves and the commitment it deserves. So, I was saying that when we go through this, there's one thing I have learned, and that I want to apologize for, or anyway admonish you to avoid, is that one of the problems with being in academia is the professionalization of your role and your knowledge, and the instrumentalization of it, and then how you have to struggle in the particular structures, very constraining ones, to succeed and to survive and to flourish there. And that isn't easy. It's very difficult. Sometimes outsiders don't understand how immensely competitive academia is at all times. And so that is an immense existential pressure. So professionalization can be a trap, or you lose sight of your original moral purpose and intention, and the means become the end, and an end in themselves, which is that I will succeed, I will succeed, I will succeed. Don't go there. I've been there and it made me miserable. And I've seen other colleagues that had the same. And this is about life, our life and our inner life. You must always go back to cultivate that inner life and find there your renewal, your memory, and your recommitment to your original intention, your moral purpose, and the meaning of this moral purpose. If you lose sight of that, I would say you're lost. And you don't want to be consumed by the conventional system, despite the fact that you need to survive and you need to succeed. It's not an easy one. But you must remain ever mindful of it. Because if you go too far, you'll suffer. And your work will suffer. And those you work with and around you will suffer. So enough about that. So conjunctures, pivotal inflection points in my lifetime, in my life in development. What are they? I wanted to identify what are they. So I was I was a child of the 60s. I was in the sort of late 60s. And, there's a time of anti-colonial struggles for national liberation, wars, many wars, huge struggles, vast canvas. And this was all around us, and then so many articulate, brilliant, eloquent thinkers from these movements, and you start to encounter them, you start to read them, see the world from their point of view. So that was there, and then the sense of rebellion in the late 60s, and the possibilities of the alternatives of a whole new world, a whole new civilization. Could we finally break out of the constraining factors of the state and class society and capitalism and war and imperialism and colonialism? Can we do this? We must do this. It's a dream, imagining it. So that's the first one. Then comes the counter movement, the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States in Mexico in 1974, reclaiming that the natural resources of the whole of the colonized world, that these are ours. They don't belong to your multinational corporations and your banks. They belong to us. And we reassert the right that they belong to us, because if we cannot control them, then we cannot develop. We cannot overcome the legacies of underdevelopment and poverty, illiteracy, and oppression unless we have this. So the fight was on. And the new international economic order, which spoke out, the Group of 77, the non-aligned movement, saying the post-World War order may have been a settlement amongst certain great powers to establish their hegemony, and and so on. But on the other hand, we regard the whole edifice of the rules as being systematically biased to disadvantage us, which, by the way, I agreed with and still agree with. And that movement had its own history and was sort of unilaterally vetoed by the Reagan-Thatcher entente, and then the increase of interest rates globally, and the next inflection, the debt crisis and structural adjustment, the last decade in the continent of Africa, the IMF becoming what we used to call it, the world's most powerful political agency, because it could intervene directly in the so-called sovereignty of so many independent or nominally independent and sovereign states. No other entity seemed more powerful than the IMF in those years. And so the next was that led to directly the globalization of neoliberalism, what we called neoliberal economic globalization, which would be, was a whole new assault against all the social responses of social protection aimed at trying to overcome those many unfair advantages of the North, and sweeping them all away for the transnationalization of capital and capital accumulation on a world scale without fetters. Without fetters. And that was promised as a telos, as a teleology of development. The same liberal promise they've been making ever since liberalism was invented, in which Karl Polanyi critiqued so brilliantly. That brought about that dismantling of all the protective measures on the globe in order to facilitate the transnationalization of mobile capital, brought about the global financial crisis, despite the fact that certain economists had gotten a Nobel Prize for saying that they had eliminated systemic risk. And there would be no more great systemic crises. Boom and bust was over. It was solved. There was equilibrium. There was stability. It was all false. There wasn't real world economics. It was just a ideology posing as scientific theory. Because the proof of the pudding, theoretically, as Fred Halliday used to say, is in the eating. So either, there's something wrong with the facts, or there's something wrong with your theory when everything goes the opposite. And you all said that was impossible. Well, then something's wrong somewhere. And I think it's in the theories or ideology. But that could have gone many different ways. That's why there are conjunctures and inflection points. Then you might add the global COVID crisis, because again, people have the aspiration that it could be transformatory. And then you see how it actually played out and revealed the embedded asymmetries, inequalities, and oppressions in the system as it's already and still perpetuating, existing as it is. But there were yet many elements of transformatory potentiality in the COVID crisis and its aftermath. And then now we come to the present conjunctures, which is a combination. The cumulative global climate change and ecological crisis. I don't wish to belabor these crises today, but we are all aware of that one. And how close we are to the tipping points and the interaction of the tipping points. It is truly frightening. Not that it was not anticipated for the past 50 years, because it was. It has been. It is. We have knowledge of this. And then there's the kind of replaying of the counter hegemonic realignment of the global South to challenge the North, which you see playing out before you at daily news feed about the BRICS and the expansion of the BRICS, the de-dollarization efforts, the buying of gold, the many ways in which this challenge is being launched once again at elite intergovernmental level, at the state system, whilst, of course, you could then lose sight of the uncountable social movements around the planet who are also exercising agency and transnationalism to challenge and transform their life world and even the system. So never lose sight of that. They're happening simultaneously, but it is like in a way full circle. Now we're back to geoeconomic, geostrategic, rivalry, fragmentations, innumerable conflicts and violence. As Mary Kaldor wrote about old wars and new wars. The old wars were, the interstate fight, the big armies and the classical war under the rules of war. But that's kind of passé. in a way. And these wars are fluid and diverse, diffused, many social actors, many militias, all kinds of mess. And they're perpetual. I mean, look at the history of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Just one example. Or Myanmar. There are so many. Afghanistan. There are many. Yeah, and this has become very worryingly widespread. So that's all part of this, what's happening at this particular conjuncture. So our work tracks these crises, these multiple crises, and what do? We have choices. We can describe, we can measure observable facts, data, events, patterns, processes. That's empirical, you know. And of course, the empirical is very impoverished if it isn't driven by the theoretical and the rigorously conceptual, where the real action intellectually, I would argue, is and must be. But we also engage in imagining and theorizing, both in terms of the causation of those patterns that we measure, but also their alternatives. Because if you know, it's like alternative history. What if, you know, the big what ifs, like that the history as we measured it and we've seen it and said observable wasn't the only inevitable one. There were many other possibilities. Some of it is contingent on chance even. Or one single precipitant event that changes, but they are not inevitable. That's determinism. And we shouldn't use deterministic analysis, we should avoid it. Got to keep that fluidity of agency with structure open, always open, and aware of it. So imagining and theorizing radical alternatives is, in my view, an essential part of global development studies at all times. Not simply describing the existing system and critically analyzing it and criticizing it. That's necessary, but not sufficient. And then there's the study of deep structures, deep history, and the causal mechanisms of structures and systems that we are part of the conditions in which we are born, in which we live, to which we respond, engage with, either internalize or try to rebel and change. So there are causation processes that emanate from the historical structures themselves. You might say that the current climate crisis and ecological crisis are one of those. The ultimate causation is there in the structures and the system itself, arguably. Yes. And then you look for what Hamid Hosseini and I, my dear Hamid friend, we're calling infra-processes. We're going to go a bit into the deeper analysis of these socio-historical structures. And things like reification as an infra-process for commodification. And the commodification is tied in historically with the decommoning of life spheres and the capitalist value creation, which then becomes normalized as value itself. The only value that has value is capitalist value. That's wrong. Fundamentally anti-human. And that's all to lead on to the accumulation of capital, and the accumulation of capital is a dominant governing force in history, which I argue it is. It has become the empire of capital, aided by the state. But then, what does it all lead to? What do I think I've arrived at methodologically? Well, I think it's historical analysis, yes, but it's historical dialectical analysis. I've come to see all these as contending social forces, and those contending social forces are mirrored or manifest in social processes. And then you see the contending social processes and the contending forms in the social processes between, yes, capital and labor, of course, capital and oikos, we call it, or commoning and decommoning, recommoning, the creation of what we call homogenized true value outside capitalist social relations, which is essential to all human life and all life, and capitalist value, which is very narrow and very restricted, and often very destructive of humanity. And then we see that in the crises that we're experiencing, how destructive it is. Capitalist value, that is. So I'll just have a bit more, talking about, I sent out a little bit of indication about this lecture that will talk about linear progress, question mark, or perpetual crisis, question mark. And I just want to, or permanent crisis, of the poly crisis. And I wanted to comment that I don't see this as a choice. I see it as a simultaneity and a unity. I'm not going to deny that there's linear progress. I mean, there's linear progress in all kinds of ways that you can measure, and people do. If they emphasize only the linear progress, then they become Dr. Pangloss. You know, you're living in the best of all possible worlds, no matter how absurd and how horrid and violent it is. It's still the best of all possible worlds, says Candide. Yes? Well, that's not very good scientific theory, is it? So much of what we call development is actually maldevelopment, and intrinsically so. For example, just a quick example, you cut down on a massive rainforest and all the life that represents, and you grow some grass and you have some cattle there. Now, in terms of GDP, that was progress. You increased the GDP, you increased your revenues, you increased the export, better for the balance of payments, all good, all positive. Only it's a catastrophe. It's negative value. And that's the truth. So why doesn't the economic paradigm say that? Well, it should. It must. It has to. That's the root of our problem, that it doesn't, or it hasn't, or still insufficiently. This is just bad economics. Attack the economists. Attack their orthodoxy. Yes. Because they're wrong. And that's what academia is. We're supposed to do that. Debate, 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 debate. Refute your opponent and refine your own argument. And work with your colleagues in a school of correspondence to create a school of thought, because there's more power there. Right? That's what we do. Well, let's do it. So I see all of this as a dialectical interplay historically. Yes, there's progress. Yes, there's crisis. Yes, there's perpetual progress and this and that, and there's perpetual crisis. And how the progress gives rise to crises. Time and time and time again. We all know this one. It's a bit of a paradox, but it's true. And then the crises can give rise to progress from their resolutions or whatever, what they set in train. Of course, we all know this. And you can look for the crisis inside the progress and the progress inside the crisis and so on. But I do want to avoid the Pangloss, whether it's Hans Rosling or Hannah Ritchie, and measuring all the ways in which you could say that Hannah Ritchie does, not the end of the world. We're almost approaching peak pollution. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that. That's good. We're almost approaching peak pollution, and that's progress. Well, anyway, I don't want to be too harsh. So I arrive at what I call, for lack of better terms, a historical dialectics of historical capitalism, or a historical dialectics of the capitalist modernity. And what do I think capitalism is? So capitalism is an inherently self-expansionary system, one that is inherently and perpetually self-destabilizing. The inner drive, the necessity of capital to infinite expansion, includes perpetual actions for systemic stabilization and for the expanded reproduction of capital. But that produces perpetual crises. And so crises are normality. All through my life, there have been crises. I've written about so many crises. You can look at the titles of the things I've published. The most frequent keyword will be crisis, crisis of development, crisis of environment, crisis of regimes, crisis of democracy, crisis of hegemony, world system crisis, environmental crisis, climate crisis, every kind of economic, political, social, it's just ubiquitous. All right, then, crisis is our life. We live in crisis, but that doesn't mean there's no progress or no potentiality for dramatic progress. So defined by whom? By the agents, of course, responding to the structures and the causation of the structures. But yet, all I've said about this inherently self-destabilizing system, the nature of it, and yet all of that, it reproduces itself still, even up to this moment. It makes every effort possible with all capabilities it can command to reproduce itself and perpetuate itself, even when staring in the face of apocalypse. The logic is kind of relentlessly inexorable to self-destabilize and restabilize and reproduce the system. But what I'm saying is that historical stability, a stationary state, is not possible in this system. It's impossible, and that is a historical analysis. It has never been so. It is not possible. And so that only leads to one conclusion, that if you seek historical stability, stationary state, that is only possible in some radically alternative forms and sources of collective social existence, our life. That's just logic. And so many people are saying that now, but it's still, inchoate, vague, not what some people are not satisfied that it's not coherent, not a single program. It's not like the 20th century, a world revolution, all power to the state. I'm not going there, right? And that's not unifying the peoples of the world these days, I don't think. Something very different is happening. And yet the message is clear, and more voices are saying, realizing that, awakening that this system, as it is, cannot be stabilized. It is perpetual polycrisis. That's its nature, right? And you will experience it if you're in it, the system. So I'm going to end up with a couple of points. One from Frantz Fanon, writing in 1961. Let's be frank. We do not believe that the colossal effort which the underdeveloped peoples are called upon to make by their leaders will give the desired results. If conditions of work are not modified, centuries will be needed to humanize this world, which has been forced down to animal level by the imperial powers. The truth is that we ought not to accept these conditions. We should flatly refuse the situation to which the Western countries wish to condemn us. He could have said that yesterday. So I self-identified myself as a protagonist of critical development studies and working with others who identify themselves as being in critical development studies. I've been in many a meeting where we couldn't reach consensus over what critical meant, but we are all critical and of each other. But I will define it this way just now. What is critical for me in development studies? It's the attitude of being skeptical always of universal, linear, progressivist narratives and their interpretations of world history and the history we are making in the present. Yeah, that's critical to me, yes? And the powers that be don't like it because they want to perpetuate the status quo, obviously, or their special interests. So the last point I want to come to is like the collective. As I said at the beginning, it isn't about me. Never been about me, and I couldn't have done anything without my colleagues, without my friends, without my family, without the help of of so many others, to which I'm always ever deeply indebted and grateful. So the knowledge construction is a co-construction of knowledge. You don't independently construct knowledge. You're the product, your knowledge is the product of even millennia of knowledge and lineages and schools of correspondence and all the mentors you met and friends you made, the books you read, right? Everything is collective. And we need to think collectively in our work and act collectively in our work. And always remember that's not a luxury or something nice. It's actually the way things are and the way they need to be for effective knowledge creation and its relevance in engaging and responding to the conditions in which we're born and to which we must respond or be complicit in the oppression and suffering they produce. That's what development studies are mean. The meaning at the heart of the purpose of development studies has always been that, and I've remembered it in the last few weeks preparing for this. Why did I come into this field? What was it that motivated me? It was that. And you should never let go of that in this field. This field has a moral purpose. So I would end on how we strive to create the spaces where that can flourish. Where an openness, not closing down and saying, I'm going to reproduce my way of thinking in every one of my students, or I am going to insist that I am right and everyone else is stupid and wrong, or I am going to be such an egotist that I don't really care what they think. Actually, I just want them to look at me. Forget that. Honestly, if you go that way, you'll suffer. It's a law. So we'll end on these thoughts. The one I like quoting the most, endlessly, is from Gramsci, and that is, we guide ourselves by pessimism of the intellect, seeing things as they really are, but optimism of the will. Never, ever let go of the optimism of the will, otherwise you become a cynic. And the last bastion of reactionaries is cynicism. It's a failure. Then the late, great Tony Benn, in Britain, who was born a lord, Tony Wedgwood Benn, and then he renounced his lordship, peerage, and became a lifelong labor activist and kind of revered figure on the broad left, including in the last years of his life. And in one of his final interviews, just before his death, as an old man, he said, all right, each generation must renew the struggle. It happens that you must engage. There will be no escape. Each generation must renew the struggle. There is no final victory. I said, but there is no final defeat. That is the dialectic. Always to be remembered. Never forget agency. Never forget the people. Never forget the potentialities in the conjunctures that can go this way or go that way, depending on us. Our life is the creation of our mind. And so finally with Fanon, who said, the struggle, they say, goes on. The people realize that life is an unending contest. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Barry. Yeah, you just we'll begin the roundtable, but then I'll have to.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Professor Gills, for setting the state. the stage to discuss development studies through your live changing interventions then and even now in your lecture, pointing to synergies between the long durée and the world system, culminating in the very long durée. As you point out, this has not only been about you. So at this stage, may I invite members of the panel to take their seats next to Dr. Huego and me as co-chairs. So, and okay. And so the panelists will present their critical comments in alphabetical order, but perhaps Professor Don Marshall would go first, as he's joining us from Barbados, where it's, as I understand, around 3 a.m. But as he said earlier, it's all for Professor Gills. So, Professor Marshall, over to you.
Greetings and thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much. I hope I'm in clear voice and that the reception is fine, that the technology allows for me to be heard and clearly. I believe if you raise your thumb or your finger, I would know that everything is going just well. I'm just waiting for that signal to indicate that everything is going just fine. Okay.
Yes.
Great, fantastic. I want to thank you, Professor Gills, for the wonderful sweep that you took us through, a sweep of memory for me, and some nostalgic, some deeply reflective, as you went through your discourse about life in development studies, and you remind us of several life-scapes that Braudel would have, and Tolstoy, I think it was, would have influenced you in terms of the shaping of this discussion. But I think my task here is to, apart from the comments that you made, I want to also emphasize the nature of the speaker, the man. You heard a bit from him about how he goes about his work, and I just want to speak to that aspect by referring firstly to his soul craft. Gills is or remains a humanist not only in terms of his unrelentless pursuit for justice and his honesty, integrity in the pursuit of such, but I think he's very much aware that the struggles for a better way do not all lie in a single paradigm, a single theory, and it's something that he has been very influential in imparting to many of us who in the mid-1990s were his students, his doctoral students at the Newcastle University. Certainly in my own work, coming as it is from the Caribbean life space with different historical and institutional starting points, it was very important that I could see in how I reflect on challenges facing Caribbean development, a range of perspectives that recognizes that, when you invent a space, a social space, on the basis of degeneracy tropes and the ideas of Black as degenerate, and ideas of the Caribbean merely as space for deviant money and deviant bodies and deviant sexualities, etc. It's important that if you're going to be thinking about the development challenge, that you have a perspective that is going to be sufficiently subtle, nuanced, and is going to capture that, that studying development in the Caribbean context must mean you have to move beyond certain kinds of narrow paradigms that speaks to growth theory, modernization theory, and the rest of it, because the Caribbean is not and has never been, as it were, sleeping beauties for Europe to give it a kiss, and through its policies, the adoption of its policies, these countries will just experience miracle growth. So meeting Barry and meeting colleagues at the time, all questioning modernization theory, and by extension questioning the dominant globalization theorem, we could not benefit better than to have someone as a mentor like Barry. The first thing Barry would have said to us is, I hope you're very familiar with the idea of globalization as epoch, and also the need to look at the knowledge produced about globalization, that is to say, the epistemology involved. We all came to different kinds of conclusions, but thematically along the lines that globalization amounts to ideology, and that it's not the globalization of markets that are of concern, really, but the marketing of globalization itself. And also, when we were looking at the best ways in which to theorize, we also recognize the value of the historical method, the value of reflection, because we thought that we had to reflect and historicize. And the reflection is not to be confused with reflexivity of the Anthony Giddens sense, but reflection in terms of, what about those concepts and categories like class, state, etc., that we've come to grow up with for such a long time? Are these categories still relevant to how we see and understand the world today? So there is, in so many ways, Barry would have influenced our thought and our directions beyond even the task of completing and thinking through how we frame our doctoral studies. In my own work, for example, I continue to do work that is critical. I do a lot of work within the decolonial tradition. I marry my own sense of IPE with a sort of post-colonial ways of framing. I'm very much someone who would question the authority of Western structures and institutions in determining what constitutes tax evasion, what constitutes money laundering in our parts, and I question why we continue to produce these classification systems that exclude London and other vulnerable spaces of the West that also engage in in providing offshore financial services. And then other work, I also do look at matters to do with climate justice, matters to do as well with reparatory justice. Ask some other critical questions there. But from the lecture that we get today, I want to conclude by saying a few things. I don't think it's just about meaning making. I think when Barry asks us to keep in mind the ways in which our profession involves a degree of competition, professionalization, etc., and never lose sight of what's important, I think it's not necessarily the meaning making that's the problem. It's the politics of meaning capture. We're involved in knowledge production, which is about meaning capture, and I find myself having to write back to empire in ways that keeps the fire in the belly. So I am very much fiercely committed to that. And the problem with it is that as you're engaging in that kind of intellectual struggle, sometimes you put your life on a hold. And I think that is where the problem comes, because your governments are many, and then also many in the NGO communities are relying on you to produce, if they see that you've got rhetorical talent, they're relying on you to help them frame positions that will remain Western epistemic centers, that they don't have the authority to do certain things, and you're drawn into different kinds of struggle on behalf of the state. And then on the other hand, you also run the risk of offending state managers by just the very way in which you frame development and you attack the orthodoxy. One of the reasons why I hold Barry up as a mentor and as someone that I admire, it's not so much to do with him going against the orthodoxy, but in everything that Barry does, he's always against the grain. And I find myself, in terms of my own personality, I tend to be against the grain a lot. And I draw my inspiration and comfort from knowing that here's someone that I would have met who is also in the struggle for meaning capture. And he's won many friends and he's won many critics, daring to go against the grain, daring to roost with certain ways of framing and seeing. So I draw a lot of inspiration from him in that regard. And finally, I do believe that what is important to focus on the fact that there are many interacting and convergent crises that do confront us, that we must also never lose sight of the ground on which we stand, the spaces in which we theorize and help to influence policy. It's very difficult sitting here in the Caribbean, recognizing how race overdetermines life chances, and not engage the Fanonian antagonism in relation to the Black-white relation, and how racism remains so very endemic in the sense in how certain spaces are deemed centers of intrigue and degenerate, and other spaces are deemed bellwethers of what should be best practice. And the levels of epistemic violence that persists, layered on top the many actual brutal physical violence that remains an enduring legacy in parts of the Caribbean, is something that we come to grips with, we try to battle with, and so on. And you're dealing with societies that have not had a long history of intergenerational wealth transfer among the Black majority. You're dealing with societies that have not had a post-plantation healing. You're dealing with societies that the trauma is so inestimable that even as the Battle Report puts out that reparations should be running in the trillions, we know that that's politically pointless to engage in, and that we have to find ways to articulate how do we fashion renewal and repair of Caribbean societies and economies in a way that doesn't say we need a paycheck, in a way that doesn't say here's a sum total of what we can calculate and estimate. You owe $17 trillion. We're caught in the throes of a discourse where lawyers and economists are sitting down and trying to work out through an understanding of tort and through capitalist understandings of value, what slavery, the slave trade, near genocide of indigenous people and so on costs. And it's repugnant, it's morally repugnant to many progressives in the Caribbean, because once you frame reparations discourse in that way, you never drive to the fact that right here and now, the debts that are accumulating by our governments are as a result of them trying to engage in infrastructure makeovers ever since formal independence, that hits their capacity to service that debt effectively. So we do need interventions of a reparatory kind, but those interventions of a reparatory kind has to be in the direction of renewal and repair in the form of investment in projects that could see transformation of societies and economies in order to positively affect life chances of those that were affected. And my final point, in terms of the drift of the conference, the theme of the conference and so on, and listening to Barry, I think with development studies, the problem is that we need much more moral content in our work. We need our work and our theorizing should reflect much more moral content. We have to ask the questions that gender theorists have been posing. We have to ask the questions that Fanon and others have been posing about the question of race and overcoming racism. We have to ask the question that LGBTQ communities are raising about what does it mean to pursue just, inclusive development. And we have to turn development studies into projects of well-being and ecological harmony. The advance in human dignity is something that Caribbean people are instinctively grappling with, and this is part and parcel of what we think remain essential goals in development studies. I shall yield at this point. Thank you.
I think I'd invite Professor Jamie Morgan to make his observations.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Hello, Barry. It's been a while. I don't have a lot to add. I come from economics and work in a business school. So the place I work for stands for almost everything that most people who are sat in the room with you find contemptible or oppose most of the time. Which doesn't mean I agree with everything that happens in business schools, obviously. But most of the time I spend my time thinking about things in a somewhat different manner than is the case in development studies as pursued by the people in the room. And I met Barry about 25 years ago, although he probably doesn't remember when we did meet. He was with Susan Strange at a Ibiza conference. But the things that have always struck me about Barry is he has generosity of spirit, intellectual curiosity, and lack of ego. Now then, if you were to ask, in some kind of Greek symposium, what makes for the perfect academic, the ideal, it would be those three things. Yes. However, those three things are not what are rewarded in academia. So it is truly remarkable that Barry has managed to maintain those three characteristics for this long and to be as successful as he has been and to be as genuinely interesting as he has been. So I have nothing but praise for Barry over the last 20 odd years. At the same time, he said two things during his public lecture, whatever we're describing this is, that one might find at least the basis of something what you could argue about. Now then, in a dialectic, ultimately there is no failure, possibly. However, for a species, there is definitely failure. And in the case of our species, failure is extinction. And we're now within the possibility that will be within lifetimes now of people who are alive at the worst case. Yes. So to a certain degree, one might say, well, that's where we really are at the moment. We're acting like we have choices we don't have in a time where we really shouldn't be doing that, because things are existential in the matter of that. Yes. So, I mean, that is definitely an important issue. And the other is, the longue durée matters, clearly. We didn't get to where we are without there being a historical process, multiple historical processes, thousands of years of what we want to describe as changes in civilizational process, yes, one kind or another. You can go back to Eridu, it's 5,400 BCE. We invent writing, it's 3,200 BCE. You can go to somewhere like, I don't know, Egypt, it's 2,950 BCE, the pharaohs arrive, etc., etc. 79 AD, rather, you've got something like Pompeii. There is a long history to go through, yes? At the same time, as it did not take the longue durée to get us to where we are now. It took the Great Acceleration, and the Great Acceleration is 30 years, and it's 30 years of working against fact, working against scientific consensus, working against the things that we can all understand to be the case in a material process. And a great deal of that is down to, my field, economics, at the same time as the political economy of economics and the power of economics and policy in the world to continue to do things based on capitalist processes that should not have been allowed to continue for this long because they were manifestly dangerous, and most people who were in a position to make those decisions knew that at the time. And that does not require a longue durée. But what it requires right now is some way of persuading people in the wealthy world to do things differently. But the wealthy world is now a divided world based on fundamental inequalities, the biggest one being wealth. How do you get the people in the wealthy world to a consensus, to change, to do the things that are required within the next few years and bring them along in something like a cost of living crisis and when everybody's distracted by war? Yes, it's hard to say how the longue durée will help us with that in particular. It may, because we can look to history and say, well, how did we deal with these things in the past? Because this is not the first kind of situation where our species has faced an extinction event. Early on in the Holocene, there were only a few thousand humans. You go back to the major civilizations, every single one of them has gone through its own localized extinction event of one kind or another. And various historians argue about those. The 4.2 kiloyear event and all of those kind of things. The kind of late Bronze Age collapse. Climate events are not new, but this kind of climate event is new, because this is global in a way which is new, right? And it's anthropogenic in a way which is down to us, obviously, because that is the very nature of anthropogenic, or if we want to call it capitalogenic. So I don't really know where I'm going with this, other than to say there's a great deal of potential here for debate about the nature of these things, which doesn't necessarily go down to our interest in the history of these things. Because, again, in an emergency, you don't spend your time arguing about whose fault everything is, right? You solve the emergency and then you move on. Yes? In what sense do theories that we have now and the increasing neologisms help us with that actual problem? Okay, that's all I have to say. Good to see you, Barry.
I think we can go with Walden. Walden can go.
So,
And then we go in that order.
share.
Yes.
Thank you, Jamie. And we will proceed with the pre-recorded video messages sent by Professors Walden Bellew and Kevin Gray. Walden Bellew was a recipient of the ISA IPE Outstanding Public Scholar Award in 2008 when Barry Gills was chairing it. So I think we also have another recipient of the Activist Scholar Award here, Professor Teivo Teivainen. And initially, we tried to reach out to Susan George to make a speech and testimonial for Barry. But Susan was the first recipient of the Outstanding Public Scholar Award. But Susan is already 90 years old. And then the second recipient is Walden Bellew. I reached out to Walden when he was in London because they had this emergency conference on global intellectual of conscience, yeah, with Professor Richard Fax and other. So this is a message from Walden Bello to Barry.
Hi, this is Walden Bello, and I'm joining you from Manila. My good friend Barry Gills is headed for a well-deserved retirement. He will, of course, be missed, but of course, we will continue to hear from him. Barry has been one of the outstanding theorists of globalization, and I have learned much from his work, but he has also had several other qualities that are worth bringing out at this point, aside from being a real very important activist scholar. He has especially worked with people from the Global South, both activists as well as academics, and with academic activists. And this work with scholars and activists from the Global South has been seen in the many projects, both political projects as well as articles and studies that he has co-authored with friends from the Global South. He also has been especially engaged in inspiring and helping younger scholars, younger progressive scholars. I think there are many who will testify to the fact, that his help, his assistance, and inspiration has, been central to their lives as academics and as activists. Not only inspiring them intellectually and politically, but actually very good friendships with them. And friendships, of course, are very, very important. Our relations are not just intellectual and political. And Barry has had this very important added dimension of friendship with young scholars as well as with the rest of us. So, as I said, we will continue to hear from Barry because he's not somebody who retires politically. He might be retiring from academic work at this point in time, but really for academics and activists like all of us, there is really, really no retirement. So congratulations, Barry, as you enter a new stage of your life, and all the best from me and from all of us, your friends in the Global South. Thank you.
Thank you, Walden. And now we're going to hear from someone who really works so closely with Barry Gills, Professor Kevin Gray from Sussex University. Okay, this is Professor Kevin Gray.
It's a real honor to be asked to speak at this event marking Barry's retirement. I've known Barry for quite some time now. We met first, I think, almost 25 years ago when I was a postgraduate student at the University of Newcastle. And as a newly arrived student, I enrolled onto two of Barry's master's module. One of them, I remember clearly, was the International Political Economy of East Asia. The other one, I'm not sure if I quite remember the title, but it was something along the lines of the state and the international political economy. And I was a student who had sort of graduated with an undergraduate degree from quite a kind of orthodox and in many ways a typically sort of Eurocentric area studies department. So, you know, coming from that background, the thing that really struck me about Barry and made an impression on me was his very strong and in many respects unwavering commitment to critical scholarship, and I was impressed by how this commitment to critical scholarship was based on a normative commitment to global justice. I mean, this was all new to me at the time, at least in a university setting. And more specifically in intellectual terms, I think what also made an impression on me was Barry's consistent emphasis on the importance of situating contemporary analysis within a much longer historical time frame than was typical, and certainly compared to what I was used to. I think most of you will be familiar with Barry's co-authored work with Andre Goodner-Frank, which dates the origins of the world system back 5,000 years rather than the 500 years put forward by Immanuel Wallerstein. It might be an exaggeration to say that this thesis was then taken up universally amongst scholars, but I think it's certainly evidence of Barry's career-long tendency and commitment to challenge established notions and wisdom. And also a consistent theme in Barry's work, as I see it, is also a refusal to be sort of confined within the narrow, methodologically nationalist approaches that remain dominant within the social sciences, and we might also say within the field of international relations and international political economy. And also Barry's commitment to taking into account the structuring effects of whether we want to call it the world system or the international, and how these shape the very processes of development. And I think this again is something that I think has stayed with me, and something that I've at least tried to apply in my own work. And in my comments, I'd just like to discuss one thing which particularly has been influential on me. So Barry and I both shared a common interest in the political economy of East Asia, and particularly of the Korean Peninsula. And this was a prominent aspect of Barry's earlier work. So I'd just like to discuss this because I think it was groundbreaking and for me, but also more broadly within studies of East Asian development. Because of course, back in the 1990s, you know, explaining the rise of East Asia, whether it's of Japan or the so-called four tigers of South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. I mean, this generated a huge amount of debate, not just amongst area specialists, but it was a debate about development, or late development, if you want to call it that, more generally. Okay, so it went beyond the region itself, and the context, of course, was also the rise of neoliberal development economics, particularly in the World Bank, which favoured a market-oriented understanding of the prerequisites of national development. And then the critique of that approach was put forward by these kind of statist, institutionalist people who emphasized the role of the state in facilitating catch-up industrialization, you know, the developmental state literature. And while that latter institutionalist literature seemed to have more of a closer correlation with empirical reality, it still left unexplained a number of factors. So, for example, well, where did these institutions actually come from in the first place, and why in East Asia and not other regions of the non-Western world? And if these statist approaches to development were so effective, then why were they effectively dismantled in the 1990s? And so for Barry, in some of his earlier publications, answering these questions involved, first of all, a critical analysis of the nature of development, but also political change, the nature of the democratic transitions that had taken place in the region. You know, some of Barry's early publications looked at, in particular depth at the case of South Korea, and saw how the political transition there had been problematized by the fact that it was synchronous with the ascendance of global neoliberalism. But this was not simply a neoliberalism that was imposed from the outside, but it was tied up with continuities in authoritarian political rule, the growing power of domestic monopoly capital. And of course, Barry also took these sort of empirical lessons, if you like, further in sort of reconceptualizing the new democracies that had emerged from that. So in an article in the Third World Quarterly, but then later in an edited volume, Barry coined the term low-intensity democracy. And that edited volume, it was co-edited with Joel Rocamora and Richard Wilson, but it had a number of very notable contributions by Noam Chomsky, Samir Amin, Andre Gunder Frank, amongst others. And so it showed, you know, in contrast to more recent popular terms like post-democracy and authoritarian neoliberalism, the idea of low-intensity democracy was an effort to shed light on the fact that these transitions were kind of compromised from the very outset because of their close alignment with neoliberalism. And also, just one other aspect of Barry's work on East Asia that I wanted to mention was about how it was his analysis was tied up with the dynamics of hegemonic and world leadership cycles. And I feel I should also mention in this respect how this shaped the analysis put forward in Barry's first monograph, which was Korea versus Korea, a case of contested legitimacy. And as the title suggests, that was an analysis of the Korean conflict, which involved a historically informed exploration of why it was that the South Korea was able to ultimately kind of triumph in terms of economic development and political legitimacy over the North in their mutual competition for international standing. And so this involved analysing how economic performance and regime adaptability to international economic circumstances had shaped the mixed fortunes of the two halves of the divided Korea. And this was situated in his broader analysis of how the Asian states engaged in industrial modernization in their reaction, which has gone on since the 19th century, to Western capitalism. So that's just a kind of overview of Barry's earlier work, which I wanted to draw attention to. I'm sure there are many speakers today who will be able to unpack other aspects of Barry's later work, but I think, you know, a lot of this kind of these intellectual questions that drove this early work also have their continuities on Barry's later kind of rethinking of development. So yes, that's it from me. But I'd just like to finish just by wishing Barry a very happy retirement. I mean, Barry, I didn't actually realize you were retiring until I received this invitation to speak. So I'm not sure if this is going to be a complete retirement from academia, or whether it's, as it is for many people, a transition to what you might call indefinite research leave. But whatever your plans are, I hope your retirement brings you a well-deserved rest and a chance to focus on whatever it is you find meaningful and rewarding. And again, thank you to the organisers for inviting me to make these comments. It's been a real honour and pleasure. Thank you very much.
The next contributor to this roundtable, in honor of Professor Barry Gills, is his recent co-author, Hamed Hosseini. And Hamed sent a written message, and he requested that I read it. Okay. The title is Celebrating the Legacy of Professor Barry K. Gills, A Journey of Transformative Scholarship and Intellectual Reflection, by S.A. Hamed Hosseini. Again, we are having some time zone challenge here because he's based in Australia. Hamed said, "Greetings from the University of Newcastle, Australia. I'm truly excited to be part of this tribute to my good friend and colleague, Professor Barry K. Gills. Barry is not just a distinguished scholar, he's also someone we look up to, a mentor and a friend. I genuinely hope that his retirement will usher in a new and exciting chapter in his intellectual journey, allowing his boundless capabilities to shine even brighter. I am sure we all agree that in today's global context, with challenges aplenty, thinkers like Barry are in high demand. I do wish I could join you in person, but the time zone differences make it a bit tricky. Nevertheless, please know that I'm here in spirit, enthusiastically celebrating Barry's profound impact on our lives, both academically and personally. Barry's profound influence extends across the realms of world systems theory, transitional movements, globalization studies, and development studies. His collaborations with outstanding scholars like Andre Gunder Frank and his seminal works like Economics and Climate Emergency, co-edited alongside Jamie Morgan, have significantly reshaped our comprehension of global economic and environmental dynamics. Moreover, his contributions to people power in an era of global crisis, co-edited with Kevin Gray, have offered invaluable insights into global resistance and liberation movements. In his role as the editor-in-chief of Globalizations, Barry has been instrumental in cultivating a diverse and critically engaged discourse on globalization. What truly distinguishes Barry is his remarkable ability to seamlessly integrate academic rigor with a heartfelt commitment to addressing pressing global issues. This fusion of scholarship and genuine concern is strikingly evident across his works, like Global Development in the Anthropocene. Furthermore, Barry's distinctive approach to critically scrutinizing the impact of neoliberalism on globalization particularly in edited collections like Globalization and Crisis, following the global financial crisis, has shed vital light on the intricacies of global capitalism and raised profound concerns related to exploitation and environmental degradation. Barry has tackled key themes in a way that has reshaped our understanding of the world. His exploration of historical globalizations goes beyond a monolithic view, emphasizing its multifaceted nature and advocating for a pluralistic approach to global history. He has also addressed the origins of capital, arguing convincingly for its historical presence over millennia, reshaping our traditional views on economic systems. Barry's research into system dynamics and agency has explored how global systems are shaped by both systemic forces and intentional changes, acknowledging the intricate interplay between structural determinants and individual or collective agency in shaping global phenomena. Perhaps one of Barry's most significant contributions is his concept of humanocentric global history, fostering a shared global consciousness among people, connecting them through a mutual understanding of their interconnected histories and nurturing a sense of global community. The list of Barry's accomplishments is extensive, and I'm sure there are many, including those who are with us today, who can delve deeper into his seminal works. I want to focus on one of our recent joint works, which I believe captures the essence of Barry's commitment to creating an impactful legacy. In the first chapter of the Routledge Handbook of Transformative Global Studies, published in 2020, Barry and I presented a compelling argument for a transformative approach in development and globalization studies. Our central message stressed the urgent need for a radical transformation of critical scholarship to address the severe crisis facing our planet and civilization. This calls for a comprehensive rethinking of critical theory, moving beyond traditional paradigms and adopting a more holistic, interconnected understanding of global issues. We argued for a scholarship that is existentialist in epistemology, judgmental in axiology, mindful of socio-ecological complexities in analysis, transversalist in intercontextual consideration, pragmatist in norms, and dialectical in ontology. I understand this might sound like a mouthful of academic jargon. If you found that intellectually intimidating, don't worry. You are not alone. I invite you to read the paper and our other joint works if you're interested. They're not as complicated as they may sound. In simpler terms, we have made a case about integrating transformative thinking and human agency in scholarship to effectively confront global challenges. Barry's work, including this collaboration, exemplifies a full commitment to transformative scholarship. It goes beyond academic pursuits, advocating for an action-oriented agenda that explores potentials for liberation and alternatives to prevailing paradigms. His career embodies the integration of academic rigor with a profound concern for global issues, fostering academic discourse that encourages diverse and critical perspectives on globalization. His commitment was not just confined to his publications, but also deeply embedded in his lived practices, which many of us have encountered in our interactions with him. Now, let me share a transcript of a short speech given by Barry when he joined the University of Helsinki in the summer of 2013. I had the privilege of visiting him in person for the first time during my sabbatical in Helsinki. And I vividly remember this tradition where newly appointed academics were taken on a city tour by Professor Teivo Teivainen. Professors were expected to deliver a brief speech on the purpose of the university. I hope that tradition is still alive there. I recorded Barry's speech and uploaded it to YouTube. For those interested in watching, you may search for, I quote, "The Purpose of the University" by Professor Barry Gills, 2013, Helsinki. Barry's definition of the university's purpose, which I have transcribed with some minor proofreading to address voice clarity issues, goes as follows, and I quote, "The purpose of the university, as Barry says, is to preserve and perpetuate the life of intellectual reflection. To achieve this, the university must enjoy complete freedom of thought and inquiry. It stands as the most precious and vital institution in our culture and civilization. Education, the pursuit of knowledge, the expansion of the mind, and the deepening of our understanding of life with regard to its value to us and our social existence cannot be quantified and should never be commodified. The entire history of intellectual thought might be said to begin with skepticism and critical questioning that challenge accepted knowledge, mythology, religion, hierarchy, the state, absolutism, and tyranny. It revolves around the question of the mind and the pursuit of what we do not know yet. The fact of critical questioning and challenging those in authority or those who claim such authority is fundamental to the life and purpose of the university. Barry then ended his speech by saying, and I quote, "I hope that you will join me in making a lifelong commitment to this principle with all your heart, soul, and mind. Let us embrace the life of intellectual reflection and stand firm against those who would impose tyranny over the freedom of thought." In closing, allow me to echo Barry's visionary words and extend his call to action. I earnestly hope that each of us will make a lifelong commitment to this principle with our whole hearts, souls, and minds. Together, let us embrace the life of intellectual reflection and stand united against any forces that attempt to curtail the autonomy of transformative inquiry. I am deeply thankful for the honor and for her presence and participation in this celebration of Professor Barry K. Gills' remarkable legacy. Let us carry forward his passion for transformative scholarship and commitment to intellectual reflection as we navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Yes. Thank you, Hamed.
We will invite a couple of comments from the room shortly, but in the meanwhile, we have two of our colleagues who would like to make some reflections. First, Professor Anya Newgren.
Good morning for everyone. In addition to what has already been said, I want to say a few words about Barry as my very near academic colleague since 2013, when Barry started as Professor of Global Development Studies here at the University of Helsinki. And about Barry's role as a founding member of EXALT, the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative here at the University of Helsinki. This initiative started for some 5-6 years ago with the idea of developing new theoretical and methodological approaches to global extractivisms understood as overextensions of resource exploitation and transformative alternatives for building more just and sustainable futures. In 2020, we applied for a Center of Excellence for Global Extractivisms and Alternatives in the Academy of Finland, or current Finnish Research Council Hall. In addition to Professor Barry Gills, the team of the PIs included Professors Maria Enström Fuentes, Markus Gröger, Franklin Obeng Odom, Teivo Teivainen, and me. Our proposal was shortlisted but not funded. Barry's contribution to the COE proposal was extraordinary, always very encouraging and looking forward, highly inspiring and with cutting-edge ideas. The idea in the COE was to analyze the political economic, political ecological, and post-colonial aspects of extractivisms and their linkages to climate change and environmental social responsibility in various parts of the world. The key idea in the research that Barry was planning to lead as PI was to link the variegated forms of extraction to global politics and concurrent crises and transformative alternatives, including climate emergencies, authoritarian regimes, but also politics of resistance and alternative imaginings. One of the core ideas of Barry was also to develop the concept of global extractivism into an analytical device to link sectoral analysis of different forms of extractivism with insights on their relations to sustainability and responsibility. Crucial in the context of contemporary insecurities, disasters, and crises, as we heard in Paris' keynote lecture. The research on global extractivisms and transformative alternatives, where Barry has been one of the foundational leaders, goes forward and will surely continue in the future. Several research projects have been funded by the Finnish Research Council and by the Kone Foundation for research on agro-extractivism, hydrocarbon extractivism, mining, tree plantations, authoritarian regimes, and politics of resistance, etc. These projects incorporate many outstanding PhD researchers, postdoctoral researchers, university researchers, and academic fellows in GDS and other social sciences and environmental social sciences. The GDS at the University of Helsinki as a research community is highly linked to analyzing extractivism, global crisis, environmental justice, authoritarian regimes, alternative knowledges, all of these key areas of Barry's research interest. The Conference of the Finnish Society of Development Research has many interesting keynotes and sessions on these topics and will surely have in the future. Barry's contribution to the Finnish Society for Development Research has been excellent. Let me say a few words of Barry as an academic leader, as a teacher, and as a supervisor, and as a co-supervisor. Barry and me have co-supervised 4 PhDs. 2 of them already completed. Anna Salmivaara on struggles of trade unions in textile industry in Cambodia, and Saila Maria Saaristo on housing occupations in Lisbon, Portugal. Then 2 of them are in progress. Antti Tarvainen's thesis on innovation economy in Israel and Palestine and intersections of colonization and innovation. And then Ville Ikävalko on political ecology of air pollution in India and Bangladesh. Barry also received an award of Best International Teacher at the University of Helsinki. I just want to mention some of the many skills of Barry as a supervisor and advisor. First, Barry's methodological encouragement for rigid conceptualization. Second, his engagement and encouragement for well-thought scholar activism. Third, Barry's wide understanding of values of different approaches and methodologies. And fourth, his skills of focusing on advising the academic work, not the researcher as a person. Barry's legacies to the future of development studies and development research for new academic leaders and young scholars, both here in Finland and abroad, are enormous. Then, something about the everyday academic life. Barry and me, we have evaluated hundreds of research proposals, students' applications for PhD study rights, and applications for academic posts together. Although we come from fairly different academic backgrounds, me from political economy, environmental anthropology, and critical resource geography, Barry as an international political economist and a well-known scholar in world systems and globalization. Still, we have had always fairly similar views of the excellent applications and excellent theses. So it has been somehow comfortable to make difficult decisions with you. During these years, we have also gone through many challenges, including a huge university reform, moving as an academic community from one building to another, drastic reductions of research funding, but still he survived. In fact, I think that with you, Barry, we never had a quarrel or even a strong disagreement between us during these more than 10 years of being near colleagues. I highly appreciate your great academic leadership your encouragement, and your support. I want to finish by using 3 mottos or slogans which Barry has used for several times during our common academic journey in different occasions. Putting them all together gives us a very inspiring spiral advice of where to focus our energies as academics in the future. So, the 3 slogans. First, thinking is writing. Second, writing is working. And third, working is thinking. Thank you so much, Barry. It has been really nice to be your near colleague. And I look forward for many more years to have you as a colleague. Probably with more time for thinking, writing, and working in the aspects that you think are the most crucial ones. Thank you so much.
Yeah. 10 years without quarrels? Well, how could you do that? Okay. Finally, that's a high standard. Our dear colleague and fellow urban and regional political economist, Antti Taipanen, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it's honor to be here, and I think we can all recognize the emotional atmosphere here that Barry has touched many of us and been able to build communities and influence us not only as thinkers but as human beings. So I started writing yesterday what I want to say, and it turned into a sort of kind of a horrible melodramatic soap opera of confession. So that's not what I'm going to do here. But I'm going to show you something from my experience working, being supervised by Barry, being his courses for quite many years, ever since doing the MA here in development studies, and then maybe come to this very present moment at the end. So Barry, as a supervisor, as a teacher, that's the kind of role that often becomes invisible except for those who are Barry students and PhD students and conduct their work under him. So that's why it's important to share his experiences. So what convinced me, big part of what convinced me to be in academia also, was the way Barry supervised during my MA thesis, which is a method of freedom. He shows you, sorry for the dusty metaphor, but he's a living library. He shows you hallways to enter, books to read. It doesn't tell you what to find or the result. This is part of the whole philosophy of non-determinism that you heard about earlier. And yeah, I remember one beautiful experience straight off from when I started doing PhD. We went to London and we visited beautiful libraries there, especially the one in Walbrook Institute. I encourage you all to familiarize yourself with the way that library is organized, very unconventionally, like Barry's library too. Second, on kind of a legacy, and I'm only touching one aspect of it, that Barry is leaving to Helsinki through his teaching, is to think the global as a method and not simply as a kind of a clearly cut sequence, a period in history, but as a realm of curiosity, as a way of looking at connections and way of resisting those clear-cut storylines and separated entities, whether spatially or temporally, that seem to reject, deny our thinking in many ways. To see the connections even within the seemingly isolated and enclosed origin points, to always look for them, and I think that's it's the most difficult thing to do. To remember that. Finally, an element of Barry's work that hasn't been so much discussed yet, and about how Barry's thinking also, what I think Anja referred when you talked about reimagination and images. What I've enjoyed a lot, endless discussions with Barry, is about thinking myth, taking myth seriously, taking image seriously, not simply as a false consciousness or kind of a idealistic phenomena that can be simply thrown away, but really think myth seriously. The meaning it brings that is often violent as well. And here I'm alluding to, in the spirit of the activist scholar that Barry also is, to the ongoing events in Gaza, and the way in which what is dropped on Palestinians is not simply bombs, but also genocidal myths that are part of the long history of a myth of civilization. You can think about what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said early on in October. This is a war between laws of jungle and humanity. This is a war between children of light and children of darkness. And you can easily see where Palestinians were thrown to the dark jungle. And this is not specific to Israel. This is a part of a long cooking myth of capitalist modernity. And to really see beyond that history is what Barry has been able to help us with, to see beyond that kind of storylines. And I think one thinker that is helpful here is also someone that I found through the hallways that Barry pointed me towards, is Walter Benjamin, who says that the state lives on a myth of repetition, on a myth of eternal recurrence. These stories, the good and the bad, and the light and the dark, the jungle and the civilization, they just keep on returning. And I think this very moment is the kind of a moment where this kind of geopolitics of banality, of idiocy, of kind of macabre myths are returning. And they are myths that keeps the time still. And it's a very violent way of keeping the time still. So in a way of going forwards, together with Barry, I hope our exchange will continue through many years to come, and towards breaking the standstill that is here. Thanks.
Many thanks, Anja and Antti. We have heard just how engaging Professor Gills has been as a teacher, as a scholar, as a colleague, as a mentor, as a friend, as an activist. Oh, how awful and oxymoronic it would be for us to leave here without engaging members of this audience. So at this point, may we open the floor for a couple of quick observations and comments. Just a couple. Yes, Sana.
Is this working? Yes. Thank you. Not a question or
really a comment, but rather just a thank you to Barry. I think, I don't know, I came to global development studies 10 years ago and really found a home. And it's very much due to what you've done to the discipline and what kind of atmosphere you fostered and created. And yeah, I think one of the things that I've tried to kind of take from you into guiding my own research and kind of thinking is your just this amazing way of being radical and sharp in thinking while always being gentle as well, and having this structural global approach as a method in a way, but always have the human at the center of that none of this becomes this kind of conceptual intellectual game, but it's always about us and humans and humanity and life in general. And I really want to thank you for that, and you've done an amazing job. Thank you for the home that you've created at GDS.
Are there any further comments? Words of thanks, appreciation? Yes, just one more. Thank you.
Just a brief moment, as I am actually one that has been kind of thrust into the whole GDS sphere in my first year of the University of Helsinki without actually knowing that I would turn out to be a GDS scholar, misplaced in the Faculty of Arts, and then just generally reaching out more and more to international political economy. Of course, you unavoidably are going to stumble into someone who has met Barry K. Gills at some point in their lives, and I just think it's really fascinating how you would just, in your work, be talking to trade union activists in Brazil who are critical of bilaterals and of free trade agreements. And then you mentioned your work in Helsinki, and like, okay, then you must know Barry K. Gills and send him my best regards. When I was talking to Gonzalo Veron, Argentinian activist, very present in Brazilian scholarship, but also, of course, trade unionists, and since the beginning of the Common Market of the South has been their critical presence, also aiding, of course, in the peasant movement. And it's, of course, Barry is eventually going to come up. So it's very interesting to be thrust into the world of IP and into Barry's world without even actually being personally acquainted with Barry yet. So it's quite the honor to be now part of this GDS circle, and of course, hopefully getting to know more of Barry's work, even as he goes into retirement. Thank you.
Oh, there's just one more. The last one, and then I will invite Professor Gills to make a few observations before we conclude the session. So you may.
Yeah, probably I'm pretty new to GDS and also Faculty of Social Science here. I want to express my sincere thanks for Professor Barry Gills, because he has opened the door for me when I had the most darkest moment in life, and he accepted me as a doctoral researcher under his supervision, even he about to retire. So I was sincerely feel like somebody in this world can really give you hope. Every time we exchange emails, we're probably not seeing each other so much, but I can always feel the spirit and strength from you. And it's guided me how I can be a better human, to care about human in the society in my lifetime. So I thank you so much for still helping young people like me, and I hope all of us will remember you in the lifetime the way I did. Thank you.
With these words of thanks, comments, I will invite Professor Gills to say just a few words, both in response to the members of the panel and to comments from the floor. Yes, only briefly.
Say anything about some fun. Okay, it's not possible. It looks like I'm not really retiring. I'm just pretending. And Tavo said that you're just pretending to be retiring. I suppose that's the way it goes. It's just a phase. Yes, what did Don say? Congratulations on entering your permanent research leave. Yes, hope so. So many wonderful things were said, and I'm deeply moved and embarrassed. And one thing I think it was very important that's under it actually has motivated me since the 1970s, when I started voraciously reading on the origins of civilization, the origins of the state, the origins of class society, and read everything I could find in anthropology, archaeology, history. Is that I concluded, and I maintain to now, why I worked on world system theory, globalization, is because I absolutely am sure that humanity is one. We are humanity. We are the people. We are one, and therefore our history is one. It's the history of humanity. And as my friend Jamie was trying to point out, I was trying to avoid doom and gloom. I think Kevin once said at a meeting we had somewhere, India, New Delhi, someplace. He said that I've never heard Barry give a talk when it didn't end or sound like doom and gloom was approaching, was imminent. So I wanted to avoid that today because there's plenty of that in the room. But I had I had thought that the unity of consciousness through reconstructing a revisionist global history, which was humanocentric, not Anglocentric, not Eurocentric, not Sinocentric, not Indocentric, not Afrocentric, but humanocentric. It's a history of one people, despite all the illusions of separations. It's a history that William H. McNeill called a history of mutuality. And through that, you would hope for or hope to encourage, by establishing that as truth and documenting it, you would see that we form a new consciousness, and that consciousness is our hope because we have also one fate. And we do face now an extraordinary existential crisis. So I don't want to say more about that because it's a bummer. So I give, but it's the truth. So that you see now the madness in my logic is whatever you want to call it, is that through establishing the unity of humanity absolutely as one and one people with one history and then one future, that changes things. And all this madness of nationalism and compartmentalization and fragmentation and rivalry and war and killing and madness. It's madness. And so we're born with a house on fire. And as Jamie said, if you're born into a house on fire, your task is to put it out. Put out the fire. And that's what I hope we're doing. And it's now or never. So my deep heartfelt thanks to absolutely everyone, and I give you there's in Geordie, the northeast of England, where I've lived so many decades. But now it's time for us to part, and I hope that we will meet again. We've spent the day But there's nought that I can bid you, but that peace and love can with you.
In concluding this session, it must be noted just how moving and, for me, how informative and inspiring this session has been. I too have been a beneficiary of Professor Gills' insight, support, and mentoring, especially during my greatest time of uncertainty, tenure-track associate professor. Well, I am now tenured, so that's proof of Barry's great strategic advice, suggestions, and guidance. Levels of support that make the hymn Amazing Grace, I once was blind, but now I can see, make more sense. Professor Gills started his professorship in 2013, pointing to crises, especially related to unsustainability, and how certain global approaches are needed to address these questions. Around 2017, he identified what he called, quote, new extractivist mode of economic development as a major obstacle to progress. From then to now, he has been looking for alternatives to this model, even attempting to redefine capital, the title of his latest co-authored book. Professor Gills' lecture today, our panelists' brilliant contributions, your excellent questions, comments, statements of praise bring us closer to the truth. The criticisms I highlighted earlier in my introduction of Professor Gills become easy to handle. Did Gills become too ecological? The answer is an emphatic no. His inaugural lecture signaled that agenda. So if critics say he is too ecological, well, that is simply proof that Professor Gills has done precisely what he promised to do. The Helsinki tradition of global development studies emphasizes relevance over reverence for traditions. For Gills, development must be understood as remaking the world from global crisis to global convergence. A continuing challenge, no doubt, but as Professor Gills shortly retires from his position, he leaves us with the following words, stated boldly in today's lecture, but also in one of his papers in the Forum for Development Studies, from which I borrow liberally and quote loosely. I have written so much about crisis, the most common keyword in my life's works. It is important that hope for a positive future be kept alive. For it is by hope and by optimism of the will that the world will most surely be transformed for the betterment of all. Thank you very much, Professor Gills. Thank you.